Welcome to ILTV'S Israel Daily. I'm Amit Harari, and coming up in today's newscast, Knesset passes overwhelming new law revoking terrorist Israeli citizenship. Meantime, oldest nearly complete Hebrew Bible being sold at a London auction, and the paycheck is high. And finally, a taste of the Holy Land's finest expert with ILTV'S Wine of the Week. The Knesset has overwhelmingly passed a law that could remove citizenship from convicted terrorists receiving payments for their actions. In a rare moment of unity in a fractured parliament, 94 Knesset members voted in favor of the bill. ILTV's Steve Leibovich reports.
Going after the so-called pay-for-slay policy of the Palestinian Authority, the Knesset overwhelmingly passed a law that would allow authorities to strip people of their citizenship or residency if they receive funds for actions deemed as terrorism.
ואנחנו ניגשים להצבעה על החוק לביטול אזרחותו או תושבותו של פעיל טרור שמקבל תגמול עבור ביצוע מעשה הטרור לקריאה שלישית. מי בעד? מי נגד? מי נמנע?
Almost the entire House agreed that the new bill was necessary and justified. The Palestinian Authority sends regular monthly payments to many convicted terrorists, a policy that Israel is strongly against and refers to as pay-for-slay, that Israeli leaders believe encourages violence. With strong support from the opposition, the law passed by 94 votes to 10, in what was a rare moment of political unity at a very divided time relating to the government's judicial reform plan.
אני קובע שהצעת חוק לביטול אזרחותו או תושבותו של פעיל טרור שמקבל תגמול עבור ביצוע מעשה הטרור (תיקוני חקיקה) התשפ"ג 23 התקבלה בקריאה השנייה והשלישית ותיכנס לספר החוקים. תודה.
Under the new law, Arab residents of Eastern Jerusalem who directly or through their families receive stipends from the Palestinian Authority after being jailed in Israel for security offenses can be deported to the Palestinian territories. It could also apply to Israeli Arabs living anywhere in Israel. Most Palestinians in Eastern Jerusalem have permanent resident status as opposed to full Israeli citizenship enjoyed by the Israeli Arab minority. The few opposition lawmakers who objected to the bill said it was discriminatory because it would not apply to Jewish Israelis convicted for attacks against Palestinians.
The army's removal of another illegal outpost in Judea and Samaria has prompted threats of a coalition crisis from Finance Minister Smotrich. Security forces yesterday began dismantling a Jewish-owned orchard and outpost that the courts had determined will build on privately owned Arab land. Smotrich objected to the action and demanded that he immediately be transferred authority over civilian affairs as agreed in the coalition agreement between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the religious Zionist Party. Dozens of protesters gathered at the Ben Eliyahu orchard near Shiloh, and there were clashes with soldiers. In an urgent letter to Netanyahu, Smotrich said the move could cause a crisis in the coalition government. Smotrich accused Defense Minister Gallant of continuing left-wing policy to uproot outposts. He went on to say that if Gallant is unable to comply with the agreement, he should resign and be replaced by another Likud minister. Former Prime Minister and opposition leader Yair Lapid called for a 60-day pause in the government's controversial plans for judicial overhaul. It remains doubtful that Justice Minister Levine will agree. ILTV's Steve Leibovich reports.
Declaring that Israel is in the greatest national crisis in the history of the country, former Prime Minister Yair Lapid suggested a 2-month break that would allow President Herzog to facilitate dialogue on the issue. The president has suggested a 5-point plan for reaching a broad agreement on justice reform and has offered to host discussions. Leaders of protests against the government plan announced that with the legislation moving full steam ahead, they would hold another nationwide strike and mass protest outside the Knesset next Monday. Yesterday, the coalition pulled a few of its reform bills from the day's Knesset plenum agenda, prompting speculation about a potential breakthrough en route to dialogue. But Justice Minister Levine and Law Committee Chair Simcha Rotman insist that the legislation of the judicial reform is continuing without pause and would continue its work as planned, at least as of now. Lapid's appeal for a pause came a day after he met with President Isaac Herzog to discuss the president's proposal for negotiations. Rothman also met with Herzog separately. Lapid said that the starting point for dialogue must be the coalition announcing a waiting period before bringing its first judicial reform bill for its first reading, currently slated for Monday.
The judicial overall controversy spilled over into a university conference as Environmental Protection Minister Effie Silman was booed and heckled and could not deliver her speech. Silman was attending a climate conference at Ben-Gurion University in Beersheba when the anti-government protesters filled the room and forced her to end her speech. Shouts of shame and chants of no climate without democracy filled the hall. The minister tried to restore order while demanding the democratic right to free speech. She told the students, "How can you yell about democracy and not let me speak?" In a statement, the university apologized for its failure to properly manage the event. The statement votes to ensure freedom of expression for all within the framework of a respectful dialogue. And joining us now is ILTV'S Jerusalem correspondent Steve Leibovich, who has been closely following what has been quite a dramatic and eventful political week. Steve, let's start with a rare moment of political unity in our Knesset voted overwhelmingly to take away citizenship or residency for terrorists who receive so-called pay-for-slay benefits from the Palestinian Authority.
Well, I think it's very clear that most people in the Israeli society and certainly in the Knesset think that it's morally reprehensible that convicted terrorists are receiving benefits from the Palestinian Authority at all. And even more so when it's Jerusalem residents who receive many benefits from their status of living in this city. They receive even the right to vote in the Jerusalem municipal elections if they want. So it's an overwhelming vote, both sides of the aisle, and it just shows you that there's a lot that can be accomplished if the two sides would actually sit and talk to each other about other issues other than the issue of judicial overhaul.
That's true. Now on to something else. A potential coalition crisis may be brewing over the uprooting of another outpost. What's the solution here?
I think it's going to be a pretty brief coalition crisis, but you saw in the visuals the specter of Jewish settlers at an outpost being physically removed with violence involved from that outpost at a time when Ben Gvir and Smotrich are in the government and saying it's a full right-wing government. Well, these two usually would be on the ground being pulled out of there by soldiers in normal times. There are actually a number of coalition members of the religious Zionists that were there and were clashing with soldiers and had to be restrained by soldiers. So the crisis really involves the authority in Judea and Samaria. Smotrich insists, and he's correct, that in the coalition agreement with Netanyahu, he is supposed to be the authority over civil matters in Judea and Samaria. Until now, the defense minister, Gallant, has had that authority in his own hands. Smotrich is now banging on the table, basically, and saying, I want this matter fulfilled. I want this changed. I want the authority. Now, the timing is interesting because this particular removal of this particular site, this orchard, was probably had to be done no matter what. And I think Smotrich banging on the table came after the removal rather than before intentionally.
Now, opposition leader Lapid is calling for a 2-month pause in the judicial reform to allow dialogue and compromise. Will the call fall on deaf ears, or do you see anything interesting happening there?
Well, there may be a compromise from that proposal of Lapid. For example, I heard former Justice Minister, opposition member Gideon Sar, say that it doesn't have to be a 60-day freeze. There's no reason that it has to be a full 2-month freeze. It can be less than that. And there are voices in Likud, David Bitan is the loudest of them right now, who are criticizing Netanyahu and are saying that he's lost control of the process and that the decision on whether or not to make a pause and to create some calm atmosphere, calming of the political atmosphere in the country, which many people say is necessary now, is not. Those steps are not being taken by the Prime Minister, and so we're starting to hear some voices in Likud saying we have to go forward and sit with the president and work something out.
Steve, thank you for wrapping it all up for us. Really interesting. Have a great weekend. Thank you. A Hebrew Bible more than 1,000 years old, being described as one of the most important and singular texts in human history, is going on sale, and we can tell you it's expected to be very, very pricey. The world's oldest and most complete Hebrew Bible will go on display in London next week, before an auction in May where it could sell for up to £50 million. Billionaire investor Kenneth Griffin set the record in 2021 when he paid $43.2 million at a Sotheby's auction for a first edition copy of the U.S. Constitution. And if the 1,000-year-old holy book sells for near its estimated value, the Codex Sassoon would become the most valuable printed text or historical document ever sold at an auction.
This Bible is incredibly important because it contains the notes created by the Masoretes between the 7th and the 9th century. And these notes, which sort of standardize the text of the Bible, appear above and below the text and also between the columns. And these notes actually, they also included, besides the notes known as Masorah, which means tradition, they included the vowel points underneath the letters, which allow us to know how exactly the words of the Bible are to be pronounced.
The Codex Sassoon is named after the previous owner, David Solomon Sassoon, acquiring the Bible in 1929 while assembling one of the most significant private collections of Judaica and Hebraica manuscripts in the 20th century. It was not until recently that the current owner, collector Jackie Safra, had the Codex Sassoon carbon dated, confirming it was older than the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex, two other major early Hebrew Bibles, according to Sotheby's.
This manuscript, Codex Sassoon, written around the year 900, contains all the books of the Hebrew Bible in one single format. It is the earliest time that we have an almost complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible.
The codex or manuscript in book form will be available for public viewing for the first time in 40 years next week at Sotheby's London, and will then go on exhibition in Tel Aviv, Dallas, Los Angeles, and finally New York in May. And as mentioned, it is expected to be extremely pricey.
This estimate on this Bible is $30 to $50 million. It is a significant estimate, but we think that it matches the importance of the Bible, which holds deep resonance and is cherished and treasured by millions of people around the world.
A fire broke out on Wednesday at noon at a factory in the center of Jerusalem and near the Bikur Cholim Maternity Hospital. The hospital was partially evacuated as a result of the heavy smoke that enveloped the area, as 9 teams of firefighters arrived at the scene and carried out searches for people trapped in the fires, and at the same time worked to extinguish the fire. After about an hour, the flames were brought under control with no casualties reported in the incident. Shaare Tzedek Hospital saying that the patients admitted to Bikur Cholim Hospital and transferred there were not harmed by the smoke, and that as a particularly measure for the female patients, it was decided to move them to the Shaare Tzedek building temporarily. The hospital also reported that about 40 mothers and babies were successfully admitted within about an hour to the maternity wards of the Shaare Tzedek Medical Center. Now, the Arrow Crowd Investor Summit this week drew over 9,000 people from over 80 countries in Jerusalem, including delegations and startups from Israel's Abraham Accords partners. ILTV'S Lidar Gravelazi sat down at the summit with Yair Lapid, the former advisor to the U.S. ambassador to Israel and a central figure behind the Accords. And he has quite a vision for the Middle East.
So I'm here with Yair Lapid, one of the architects, I think, of the Abraham Accords. Certainly an active participant.
An active participant, a former advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is such an exciting event.
And it must be especially exciting for you to see sort of your work here in action. We're in Israel, Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, and we have delegations from Morocco, delegations from Gulf states. I mean, how does that feel to see it in action?